The cabin was unusually quiet for a first-class section. No clinking glasses, no soft laughter, no relaxed chatter that usually floated through the air once the seatbelt sign went off. Instead, there was tension, thick and uncomfortable, settling into every row like invisible fog. Passengers could feel it without knowing why. Something had already gone wrong, and no one yet understood how big it would become. It started with something small, almost laughably small. Emil. The man sitting in seat 1A didn't look angry at first. He was calm, almost unreadable, dressed simply in a dark jacket and crisp shirt. No flashy watch, no obvious signs of wealth. Most passengers would have assumed he was just another business traveler, maybe tired, maybe thinking about work. What they didn't know was that he was the CEO of one of the world's fastest-growing tech logistics companies, a man whose decisions moved markets, whose signature could end careers, and whose name was known in boardrooms but not tabloids. He had boarded the flight quietly. No assistance, no announcements, no demands. He smiled politely when greeted and nodded when his coat was taken. Everything about him suggested restraint, control, the kind of person who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. When the flight leveled off, and the cabin crew began their service, first class was supposed to be effortless luxury. Warm towels, carefully plated meals, a sense that everything was already handled before you even thought to ask. But when the menu reached seat 1A, the attendant hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, eyes dropping for just a second. "The first-class special is no longer available." He looked up at her, not sharply, not rudely, just a pause. "No longer available," he repeated. "Yes, sir." There was a mix-up. Some meals were loaded incorrectly. "We can offer you one of the business class options." Around them, other passengers pretended not to listen, but everyone was listening. In first class, a missing meal wasn't just inconvenience, it was a breach of promise. The CEO leaned back slightly. "So everyone else in first class was served?" She nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. I do apologize." He thanked her. Actually thanked her. Said it was fine. Said he understood. The attendant looked relieved and moved on quickly, as if escaping a moment that could still turn dangerous. But the calm didn't mean acceptance. As the flight continued, subtle changes began to ripple through the cabin. The CEO didn't complain, didn't ask for a supervisor, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he observed. He noticed how requests from other passengers were handled. He noticed delays, the way certain guests were prioritized while others were brushed off with rehearsed apologies. He noticed tension among the crew, whispered conversations, hurried steps, glances exchanged when they thought no one was watching. This wasn't about a meal anymore. This was about respect, systems, and something much deeper. By the time the plane began its descent, the CEO had already made a clue. Discreetly, his phone angled away from prying eyes. He didn't speak long, just a few words. Calm words, the kind that don't sound dangerous until much later. The passengers felt the shift before they understood it. The cabin crew too, though they couldn't explain why their nerves were suddenly tight. The lead attendant smiled a little less. The purser checked her tablet again and again. Something was coming, and the aircraft itself seemed to sense it as it cut through clouds toward the runway. After landing, applause broke out, scattered but polite. The CEO remained seated, hands folded, eyes forward. He waited until the seatbelt sign turned off, until the aisle began to fill with movement. Then he stood. That's when everything changed. Instead of reaching for his bag, he turned toward the front galley. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Could I speak to the lead crew member for a moment?" The request was reasonable, professional, but the tone measured and final made the nearby attendants freeze. The purser approached, smiling automatically, the kind of smile trained into existence. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" He introduced himself then, not with arrogance, not with drama, just his name and his title. The smile faded. Around them, passengers slowed. Some stopped altogether. Phones appeared, not obviously, but enough. The air thickened again, heavier than before. "I want to understand," the CEO said, "how a first-class passenger can be denied a confirmed service without explanation, while others are accommodated." The purser began to speak, offering policy, logistics, apologies. The words came fast, practiced, layered with corporate language, but the CEO listened in silence, his expression unchanged. When she finished, he nodded once. "Thank you," he said. "That's all I needed to hear." He turned away, leaving confusion in his wake. The purser stood there, unsure whether she had just survived. A complantor stepped into something far worse. What no one on the plane knew was that this airline had just signed a massive corporate travel contract with his company, a deal worth millions, a deal that relied on consistent service, professionalism, and respect, not just for executives, but for everyone. And what no one knew was that his call earlier hadn't been to an assistant, it had been to his legal team. As passengers exited the plane, whispers followed them down the jet bridge. Some said the man in 1A was overreacting. Others said airlines needed to be held accountable. Most just sensed they had witnessed the opening scene of something bigger than a missing meal. Behind the scenes, messages were already being sent. Reports requested, names logged, policies reviewed. The CEO didn't storm off the plane. He didn't shout, He didn't threaten. He simply walked away. Minutes later, while the crew was still resetting the cabin, assuming the worst was over, a notification arrived at the airline's headquarters. Then another, then a call marked urgent. By the time the crew reached the terminal, smiling and exhausted, unaware of what had begun in the air, decisions were already being made, decisions that would shock them, spark debate online, and force an entire industry to confront an uncomfortable question. Was this about entitlement or accountability? And when the consequences finally landed, they would land hard on people who never imagined a single denied meal could cost them everything. But that part of the story hadn't happened yet. Not until the doors closed behind the crew, and a message waited for them, one that would turn confusion into disbelief, and disbelief into fear, because the real fallout didn't happen at 30,000 feet. It happened minutes after landing. The message didn't arrive with a sound. No buzz, no vibration loud enough to draw attention. It appeared quietly on the lead purser's phone as she stood near the baggage claim, still chatting with a colleague about hotel shuttles and delayed connections. At first, she didn't open it. Crew messages after landing were usually routine schedule updates, reminders, minor notes about paperwork, nothing that couldn't wait a few minutes. But then she noticed the subject line: immediate review required. Her smile faded as she stepped aside, the noise of the terminal suddenly distant. She opened the message and read it once, then again, slower this time, as if her eyes were refusing to accept the words in the order they appeared. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Across the hall, two flight attendants laughed softly, unaware that something invisible had just shifted beneath their feet. The CEO, meanwhile, was already gone. He moved through the airport like he had moved through the cabin without spectacle. No lingering glances, no second looks back. He didn't need to see the impact of what he had set in motion. Experience had taught him that consequences didn't require an audience. For him, this flight wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reminder. Years earlier, before the private cars and boardrooms, before assistants screened his calls and people nodded before he finished speaking, he had been just another passenger, another number on a manifest. He remembered standing in long lines, being spoken over, dismissed with rehearsed politeness that barely hid indifference. He remembered being told policies mattered more than people, and he remembered promising himself that if he ever had the power to change systems, he wouldn't look away when those systems failed. That promise followed him now, echoing louder than the hum of the terminal. Back with the crew, confusion spread quietly. The purser called the captain, her voice low, words careful. The captain listened without interrupting, his brow furrowing as the message was read aloud. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he finally said. "We don't know what this is yet." But even he didn't sound convinced. In the crew lounge, phones began lighting up, one by one. Some messages were vague, others more direct, all carrying the same undertone: stay available, remain reachable, do not leave the airport yet. For a team that had just completed a long-haul flight, exhaustion mixed with unease. "What's going on?" one attendant whispered. "No idea," another replied, scrolling nervously, "but this doesn't feel normal." Rumors filled the gaps where information should have been. Someone mentioned a high-profile passenger. Someone else recalled the meal issue in first class. The story began to take shape, distorted by fear and speculation. "He didn't even seem angry," one attendant said quietly. "That's what scares me." At airline headquarters, the atmosphere was very different. Screens glowed late into the evening. Executives who had planned to leave early stayed put. A contract manager pulled up documents related to corporate partnerships. Another reviewed internal service reports, scrolling through logs. Timestamps names. The CEO's name appeared on the screen, followed by a company logo. Everyone in the room recognized. Silence settled in. "The account alone represents a huge portion of our premium bookings," someone said carefully, "and they just renewed." Another added, "Or were supposed to." No one said what they were all thinking. They didn't need to. Back at the airport, the crew waited. Time stretched. Bags were collected and rechecked. Coffee cups went untouched. Every few minutes, someone glanced at the door, expecting an announcement, a manager, anything. The purser replayed the flight in her mind. Every interaction, every decision. She wondered if she had missed something earlier, some small moment where she could have changed the outcome. She thought about the CEO's calm voice, the way he listened more than he spoke. That unsettled her more than anger ever could. People who yelled burned out fast. People who stayed quiet tended to leave damage behind. Elsewhere in the city, the CEO sat alone in a car, watching traffic slide past the window. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Yes," he said simply. There was no emotion in his voice, but there was focus. He listened, asked a question, nodded once though no one could see him. The call ended quickly. Outside, the city lights blurred, but his thoughts were sharp. He wasn't interested in punishment for the sake of punishment. He was interested in truth, in patterns, in whether what happened to him was rare or routine. If it was routine, that meant countless others had experienced it too. Without the ability to push back, that idea bothered him more than the meal ever had. Back in the crew lounge, a supervisor finally arrived. Her expression was professional, controlled, but her eyes gave her away. She asked the crew to sit, asked them to listen carefully, asked them not to panic. Those words did little to calm anyone. She explained that a formal review had been initiated following feedback from a corporate partner. She emphasized that this did not mean conclusions had been drawn, that cooperation was important, that statements might be requested. The word review echoed in the room. Are we in trouble? Someone asked. The supervisor paused. Right now, she said, choosing her words. We're gathering information. Information. Another word that sounded harmless until it wasn't. As the night wore on, more messages arrived. Individual interviews scheduled. Service logs requested. Names cross-checked. A process unfolding piece by piece. Quiet but relentless. Online. Nothing had surfaced yet. No headlines. No viral clips. Just the calm before something that hadn't found its shape. The crew dispersed eventually, each person carrying their own version of the same fear home with them. Sleep didn't come easily. Phones stayed close. Notifications felt louder in the dark, and somewhere between anxiety and exhaustion, one thought kept repeating in their minds, all this, over a meal? But deep down, they knew it wasn't. Because systems didn't crack from one small incident. They cracked when small incidents revealed something bigger underneath. The CEO knew that too. As dawn approached, he reviewed notes sent by his team, not accusations. Just observations, patterns, complaints that looked isolated until you stacked them side by side. He closed his phone and leaned back. The story was still unfolding, and the people caught in the middle had no idea how far it would go or how close they already were to the moment that would change everything. But that moment was still ahead. Waiting. By the second day, the silence had become its own kind of noise. Inside the airline's operations building, doors opened and closed more often than usual. Meetings were called without calendar invites. People who normally stayed behind the scenes were suddenly visible, walking briskly with folders tucked under their arms, speaking in lowered voices. The company hadn't made any public statement, but internally, everyone could feel that something serious was unfolding, and it was being handled at the highest level. For the crew, the weight was unbearable. Each of them had been asked to submit individual accounts of the flight, not just the incident in first class, but everything. How service was handled, how decisions were made, what pressures they felt. The questions were polite but thorough, written in a way that made it clear every detail mattered. One attendant stared at her screen for nearly an hour before typing a single sentence. She wasn't sure what to say anymore. The truth felt complicated. Yes, the meal situation happened. Yes, it shouldn't have. But was that enough to trigger this kind of response? She thought about her years with the airline, about days when flights were understaffed, when supplies were short, when policies changed faster than training could keep up. She remembered moments when she had followed the rules and still been blamed by passengers. Other times when she had bent those rules just to help someone. Where did responsibility really sit? Across town, the CEO was asking similar questions, but from the opposite side of the aisle. He met with his team in a quiet conference room, walls of glass overlooking a city that never seemed to slow down. On the table were printed summaries of passenger feedback from dozens of routes, not just his flight, flights across regions, complaints that sounded eerily familiar, denied services, inconsistent treatment. Passengers made to feel small, unheard, brushed aside. These aren't extreme cases. Someone on his team said, they're subtle. That's why they slip through. The CEO nodded. Subtle failures were the most dangerous. They didn't trigger alarms. They normalized themselves. This isn't about revenge, he said calmly. It's about standards. Still, even he understood the weight of what was happening. Real people were involved. Crew members with families, routines, lives that existed far beyond a single flight. Accountability, if handled carelessly, could easily turn into collateral damage. That tension followed him out of the room. Back at the airline, leadership debated next steps. Some argued this was being blown out of proportion. Others warned that ignoring it would be worse. The corporate contract at stake loomed over every conversation, unspoken but present. What if this goes public? Someone asked. It already could have, another replied. The fact that it hasn't might mean something. That uncertainty was unsettling. No leaks, no posts, no dramatic statements. Just pressure, building quietly. Meanwhile, the purser received a call asking her to come in for a formal discussion. She dressed carefully, choosing neutral colors, professional lines. On the drive over, she rehearsed answers she hadn't been asked yet. Inside the conference room, she faced people she had never met before, executives whose names appeared in emails but whose faces were usually absent. They listened as she spoke. They asked her to walk through the sequence again. They asked about staffing, supplies, communication. At one point, one of them leaned forward. Did you feel supported by company policy in that moment? The question caught her off guard. I followed the policy, she said slowly, but it didn't feel flexible. They exchanged glances. Flexibility, another harmless word that carried weight. Outside that room, other subplots unfolded quietly. A junior attendant wondered if this would affect her promotion. A veteran crew member considered early retirement. The captain reviewed procedures, searching for any misstep that could come back to him. Everyone was trying to protect themselves, even as they claimed to be focused on the bigger picture, and looming over all of it was the question no one wanted to say out loud: would heads roll? The CEO's company, meanwhile, paused all non-essential travel bookings with the airline. Officially, it was framed as a temporary review. Unofficially, it sent shockwaves. Revenue analysts noticed immediately. Alerts went off. The airline reached out, requesting a meeting. The CEO agreed, but not right away. He wanted to see how they handled the process without pressure, whether they looked for scapegoats or solutions, whether they listened. As days passed, internal memos circulated. Words like service, integrity, and brand alignment appeared more frequently. Training modules were mentioned. Audits expanded. What began as a single denied first-class meal was now touching nearly every department, and still, nothing had been resolved. For the crew, the waiting became personal. Some stopped checking their phones, unable to handle the anxiety. Others refreshed their inboxes constantly, bracing for news that hadn't arrived yet. One attendant broke down during a routine grocery run, overwhelmed by the thought that her career might hinge on a moment she barely remembered anymore. "This feels unfair," she told a friend later, "like we're paying for something bigger than us." Maybe they were. The CEO understood that too. Late one night, he reread the initial report from his legal team. It laid out options. None of them were simple. Each path carried consequences, not just for the airline, but for the people inside it. He closed the document and stared out the window. Leadership wasn't about proving power. It was about choosing where to apply it. At the airline, an internal deadline approached. A recommendation would soon be made. Not final decisions, but a direction. Word of that deadline leaked, and tension spiked again. In hushed conversations, the phrase "entire crew" surfaced. No one knew where it came from, but once spoken, it took on a life of its own. Fear amplified it, distorted it. Was it true? Was it exaggerated? No one could say. All they knew was that something irreversible felt close. And as both sides prepared for the next move, the airline weighing risk and reputation, the CEO weighing principles and impact, the story stood at a dangerous edge, because once the decision crossed from review to action, there would be no way to undo what followed. And that moment was coming fast. By the fourth day, the tension had become almost tangible. The airline's headquarters hummed with a nervous energy, quieter than usual but far more urgent. Phones rang and went unanswered. Emails piled up with subject lines that no one dared open in the wrong order. Every corridor held whispered conversations. Everyone was aware that the CEO's visit, scheduled but unconfirmed, could change everything, and no one knew exactly how. For the crew, the uncertainty had become unbearable. They had been called individually for interviews, each meeting leaving them more drained than the last. One young flight attendant, barely 6 months into the job, sat at home staring at her phone, heart racing. She had answered every question truthfully. She had cooperated fully. And yet the fear of what might come of losing everything in an instant kept her from eating, from sleeping, from thinking clearly. The purser, who had more than a decade of experience, felt it differently. She had been through crises before, yet nothing had prepared her for this. The messages from corporate were polite, almost clinical, but she could sense the undercurrent. Someone somewhere wanted accountability, and it would be swift, unforgiving, and absolute. She kept replaying the flight in her mind, the calmness of the CEO, the denied meal, the way he had never raised his voice, and wondered if that had been the trigger for what was now coming. At the same time, the CEO was making moves of his own. He wasn't in a boardroom this time, but rather in a quiet office overlooking the city streets below. His team had prepared detailed reports of systemic failures, patterns that extended far beyond a single flight. Complaints, delays, inconsistencies, lapses in service, standards, all of them tied together in a web he could trace with precision. He didn't take pleasure in this. He didn't need vindication. What he wanted was clarity, accountability, and change. Yet even as he reviewed these patterns, he was aware that real people would bear the brunt of his actions. Flight attendants, pilots, support staff, none of them had intentionally caused this. And yet, in the balance between principle and consequence, decisions would have to be made. The weight of that reality made his fingers tighten around the documents in front of him. Back at the airline, leadership was fracturing under pressure. Executives debated fiercely behind closed doors. Some argued that this could be a chance to demonstrate integrity, to show that the airline valued its passengers and its corporate partners. Others worried that overreaction could destroy careers, morale, and reputation. Yet no one could deny that the contract at stake and the potential fallout made this an event unlike anything they had faced before. Rumors leaked quietly among employees. Hushed speculation about terminations, suspensions, and restructuring floated from lounge to lounge. The phrase "entire crew" circulated again, more boldly this time. Whispers turned into anxious questions. Who, what, how severe? Each question, left unanswered, fueled panic. The night before the formal meeting with the CEO, the crew gathered again, not in official capacity, but in quiet solidarity. They shared fragments of information, notes from interviews, and personal fears. Every glance, every half-smile, was filled with tension. None of them slept well. Phones were charged and nearby, ready to ring with news that could change everything in a single instant. Meanwhile, the CEO reviewed the airline's responses one last time. Reports, memos, and internal audits had been compiled. Everything pointed to systemic issues: lapses in service, insufficient training, miscommunication between departments. It wasn't just a first-class meal. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a problem that had allowed small errors to snowball into situations that could damage reputation, relationships, and trust. He didn't rush the process. Patience was his tool, observation his weapon. He understood that real change came not from emotion, but from clarity. Yet he also knew that delay would amplify fear. The crew, the executives, the passengers, they were all caught in a pressure cooker, and the release valve had yet to be opened. The morning of the meeting arrived with a crisp, uneasy calm. The crew members who were summoned arrived early, nerves coiled tightly like springs. Every face carried the same question: what would happen when the CEO walked into the room? The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Even airport security officers, unaware of the full story, sensed that something unusual was afoot. Inside the boardroom, the executives waited, shuffling papers and reviewing notes for what felt like the 100th time. The CEO's arrival would mark the tipping point. Every decision, every glance, every word spoken in that room would carry enormous weight. Some of them were already regretting not preparing better. Others knew that there was no preparation that could eliminate the tension. Outside, employees whispered about the CEO's reputation. They knew he was decisive, they knew he was principled, but they also knew he was not impulsive. His calm exterior masked a mind that calculated consequences meticulously, and that made the unknown even more intimidating. The crew sat quietly in the lounge nearby, their hands trembling slightly, their minds racing. The younger attendants leaned on the veterans, seeking reassurance that wasn't there. The veterans maintained a steady composure, though their eyes betrayed unease. Everyone could feel the moment approaching, the moment when uncertainty would give way to action. And then, the word came through the airline's internal communications system. A simple message: prepare for CEO review. Immediate attendance required. Time seemed to contract. The crew, already on edge, moved like automatons toward the boardroom. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. Inside, executives glanced at each other, realizing that this would not be routine. Not anymore. The first-class meal, the denied service, the calm observation of a passenger in 1A8 had all built into this moment. The story that had seemed small, almost trivial, had grown into a crisis whose resolution could change careers, contracts, and company culture all at once. The door opened, and the CEO entered. His presence was understated, almost casual, yet it filled the room with a quiet gravity. No one spoke. Every eye was fixed on him, every mind alert to the weight of what was coming. His calm demeanor only intensified the tension, because everyone knew that decisions would be precise, deliberate, and uncompromising. The crew took their seats, and for a moment, the room held its collective breath. The CEO scanned the room, his gaze steady. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of the situation to settle on everyone present. Then he began, not with anger, not with threats, but with questions. Precise, measured, probing questions that cut through assumptions and excuses. Every word landed deliberately, every pause weighted with meaning. The crew answered cautiously, aware that each detail could carry consequences far beyond their control. Executives shifted in their seats, aware that the conversation was not just about procedure. It was about culture, accountability, and systemic integrity. Every answer, every hesitation, added fuel to the suspense. Nobody could predict where this would end. The tension built with each passing minute. The crew felt it in their chests, the executives in their jaws, the CEO in the deliberate rhythm of his questions. It was a collision of perspectives, of principle versus procedure, of fear versus accountability. And at the edge of every exchange, the unspoken question loomed: how far would this go? No one could answer. And that uncertainty, that raw, unrelenting anticipation, made the room almost unbearable. The climax was near. Every glance, every question, every careful response brought them closer to a breaking point. The story that had begun with a single, denied first-class meal now encompassed careers, reputations, and trust. Every person in that room felt the weight of what was about to happen, and the suspense stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Outside the room, the city continued its routine, oblivious to the high-stakes tension contained within those walls. But inside, everything hung in balance. One more word, one more decision, one more acknowledgement could trigger a cascade that no one in that room would be able to undo. And yet, the resolution remained just out of reach. Everyone waited, hearts racing, breaths shallow, knowing that the next moments would decide everything, but no one knew how the story would finally end. Just as the tension in the boardroom reached its peak, a soft chime echoed from one of the assistants' laptops. It was easy to miss, almost casual, but in that charged silence, it felt like a gunshot. The assistant hesitated before opening the notification. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then she blinked, frozen. The message wasn't from the CEO's team. It wasn't from internal audits or routine reports. It came from a passenger, someone who had been seated in first class, 2 rows behind the CEO, someone who had recorded the entire flight on their phone. The video, now circulating on social media, showed every interaction, the meal refusal, the quiet tension, the calm observation of the CEO. The boardroom went silent. Eyes darted toward the assistant, then to the executives, then to the crew who had been brought in for the review. Every face reflected the same realization. The situation was no longer contained. What had started as an internal review of service standards had now gone public. Every airline employee in that room,